Emma had never been to Black Hollow before, but the stories she had heard on obscure internet forums and whispered by locals were enough to make her blood run cold. As a true crime podcaster from New York, she had chased countless urban legends, but something about this small town gnawed at her curiosity with a more primal force. The silent children were said to vanish into the dense forest surrounding the town, never to return. Parents forbade their children to go near the misty outskirts, and anyone who entered after dusk was rumored to emerge changed, pale and whispering secrets that didn't belong to them. She parked her rental car on the edge of the town, where the cracked asphalt met gravel, and the fog began to thicken like a living blanket. The street lamps flickered weakly, struggling against the heavy mist. Emma wrapped her jacket tighter around her body, though the chill wasn't from the cold, it was the oppressive sensation pressing against her chest. A subtle pressure that whispered of unseen eyes. Her footsteps crunched softly on the gravel as she approached the start of the forest trail. The faint rustle of leaves in the fog sounded almost like a sigh. With every step deeper into the trees, the town seemed to vanish behind her, swallowed by the mist. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Shadows moved at the edge of her vision, dissolving whenever she turned her head to look. Her camera light cast trembling beams across gnarled roots and twisted branches, revealing fleeting glimpses of shapes that seemed humanoid, but impossibly elongated. Emma shook her head. "It's just shadows. Just fog," she whispered to herself, though the echo that returned was slightly too fast, almost mimicking her own voice. The recorder she carried for ambient sounds, which she had turned off, suddenly flickered to life. A faint static hiss preceded a soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, but wrong somehow off-key. Stretched. Emma's heart leapt. She crouched, picking it up, staring at the small device. "Hello," she called, her voice unsteady. The forest didn't respond, but the giggle repeated, closer now, threading through the mist like a thin strand of silk tugging at her mind. The path twisted unexpectedly, the familiar trail seeming to stretch into an impossible length. Emma's instinct screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity anchored her feet in place. The stories detailed and vivid about children's faces appearing at windows, whispers calling strangers by name, unseen hands brushing against passers-by played in her mind. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound bouncing between the fog-dense trees. Something wasn't right. The mist itself seemed to pulse, swirling around her ankles like liquid shadows, curling and retreating as though watching, waiting. A sudden snap of a twig behind her made her jump. Emma spun around, flashlight sweeping the foggy expanse. Nothing. She tried to steady her breathing, feeling sweat prickling at her neck despite the cold. Then she saw just a glimpse, almost too fast to register, a small figure, pale, standing motionless between two massive oaks. It was gone the moment she blinked. Panic bubbled under the surface, yet fascination anchored her in place. She whispered into her recorder, "I see something. A child. No, not a child. Something." Her own voice sounded strange in the device, warped and echoing. The fog thickened, crawling higher like a living entity. Branches seemed to bend toward her as she passed, brushing against her jacket, against her arms. Lightly, teasingly. Emma's skin prickled as the whispering began soft, almost imperceptible. Carried in the wind, but not quite in the wind. She froze. The whispers weren't words, not yet, they were tones, patterns. A language of unease that tugged at memory, at fear, without explaining itself. Emma swallowed hard, straining to listen. And then a single word cut through the mist like a shard of glass. "Leave." Her pulse hammered. "No," she muttered, more to convince herself than the forest. She pressed on, guided by the faint path and her unshakable need to understand. Then, through the gray haze, she noticed something unnatural. The fog ahead seemed thicker, darker. almost black at its center. It swirled in patterns, curling around shapes that moved against the natural flow of the wind. Emma's stomach turned. This wasn't whether this was intent. The mist was reacting. At the edge of the clearing, an abandoned house emerged, its dark silhouette towering against the pale moonlight filtering through the mist. The windows were black voids, reflecting nothing, absorbing the flashlight's beam. Emma's recorder began crackling wildly, the childlike giggles overlapping, forming an unholy chorus. She stepped closer, her feet crunching on the dead leaves and broken glass scattered around the house's foundation. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, but the pull of the unknown anchored her gaze to the shadowy doorway. As she raised her camera to capture the structure, the front door creaked slightly, as if nudged by unseen fingers. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but to Emma, it was deliberate beckoning. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath, and walked toward it. The air grew heavier, dense and metallic, and her flashlight flickered intermittently. The whispering intensified, rising in pitch, forming fragments of words. "Come, join I lost." Emma's heart thudded painfully against her ribs, each beat punctuated by the soft tap of unseen footsteps that seemed to mirror her own. She reached the door and placed her hand on the rotting wood. It felt warmer than it should have, as if alive. A gust of icy air seeped from the threshold, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay and something sweet, almost sickly, like old candy left in the sun for decades. Emma's recorder fell from her grip, rolling to the floor and continuing to broadcast a warped, childlike laughter interspersed with shrill whispers. She bent to pick it up, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw dozens of pale faces reflected in the dark windows, pressed against the glass. Mouths open in silent screams. A sudden snap of the floorboard inside the house made her jump back. The door, once barely ajar, now creaked wider, inviting her in. The mist outside seemed to seep toward the threshold, curling into the house as if leading her into its depths. Emma's rational mind screamed that she should leave, that all the podcasts and legends she had chased meant nothing against this. And yet, she stepped inside, feeling the floorboards groan under her weight. The house seemed to inhale around her, the shadows shifting, elongating, and twisting. The whispering grew louder, almost forming words now, though she couldn't understand them, and the faint outlines of small hands pressed against walls reached toward her. A shiver ran down her spine as she took another step, flashlight trembling. The doorway slammed behind her with a deafening bang, the sound ricocheting through the house like a scream. Emma's heart raced, and the recorder clattered to the floor beside her. She crouched, hands shaking, as the whispers escalated into a cacophony of voices, soft laughter merging with cries, calling her name in tones that weren't human, tones that seemed to pierce directly into her mind. And then she saw it. A fleeting shadow moved across the hallway ahead, a small, pale figure with eyes too dark to reflect light, mouth open in a scream that made no sound. Emma blinked, and the figure was gone. The fog outside seemed to press against the walls of the house, curling and writhing like living tendrils. And she realized the truth her instincts had been screaming all along. She had crossed into a place that did not belong to the living. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the whispering continued, layering over itself, growing louder, closer, until the mist inside the house seemed to dance with intent. Emma's rational mind teetered on the edge, fear gnawing at every thought. She whispered a single word into the recorder, barely audible over the rising tide of voices. "Why?" The house answered. Emma's flashlight flickered violently as she stepped further into the house. The air inside was thick, heavy, and metallic, carrying a faint, sweet rot that made her stomach twist. Each footstep on the creaking floorboards seemed impossibly loud, echoing through the darkened halls like the pounding of a war drum. Shadows stretched and flickered along the walls, twisting into shapes that felt both human and grotesque. She could feel the house shifting around her, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were alive and breathing, waiting for her to falter. The whispering had grown louder, filling every corner of the house, overlapping in a dozen tones that clawed at her mind. Some were soft and childlike, others guttural and ancient, all calling her name in ways that made her skin crawl. Emma's pulse raced, but curiosity anchored her steps. She had come too far to turn back now. With her camera held tightly in one hand and the recorder in the other, she followed a hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls dark and glistening, absorbing the light. Suddenly, she froze. At the end of the hallway, in a shadowed doorway, a small figure crouched, its pale face illuminated just enough to reveal hollow eyes and an expression of unbearable sorrow. The silent children. The stories had called them, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight of one. The figure didn't move at first, but the whispering around her intensified, layering into words she could almost understand. Join us. Stay, never leave. The air grew colder, pressing against her skin like icy fingers. Emma's rational mind screamed at her to run, but her body felt rooted to the floor. She took a hesitant step forward, and the figure vanished, replaced by dozens of shadows merging into the walls. The house seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, the floorboards stretching and contracting beneath her feet as if testing her resolve. She raised her camera, hoping to document the phenomenon, but the lens reflected only black deep, impossible voids that seemed to peer into her very soul. The whispers became a cacophony of laughter and sobs, a symphony of the lost, the trapped, the forgotten. Emma's recorder began to shake violently in her hand, playing back her own voice warped and distorted. A single voice, older and hollow, separated itself from the mass. You belong here now. Emma stumbled backward, nearly dropping both devices. She could feel the mist creeping in through cracks in the walls, winding around her ankles, tendrils of cold that seemed alive. Panic surged through her, and she bolted down the hallway, desperate to escape. But the house had no end. Every turn led to another corridor, another room, identical and yet subtly wrong, stretching impossibly. Shadows darted from corner to corner, always at the edge of her vision. Figures emerged from the darkness, fleeting glimpses of pale faces, hollow eyes, and open mouths screaming silently. The children were everywhere, multiplying with each step she took, filling the house with their presence, their sorrow, their hunger. Emma's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was hallucination, stress, fear. But the recorder captured voices she couldn't explain, whispers of secrets that weren't hers, warnings in a language older than the town itself. The house was alive, feeding off her fear, amplifying every heartbeat, every instinctive shiver. She realized she was not the first to enter, and she would not be the last. At the center of the house, she found a staircase descending into darkness, a blackness so deep it seemed to swallow the light from her flashlight. The whispers pulled her down, beckoning, and a horrible understanding gripped her. The silent children were not missing. They were here, bound to the hollow, part of the house itself, feeding on the fear and life of anyone foolish enough to enter. Every rumor, every tale, every warning had been true. Emma's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in pitch darkness. The whispers escalated into screams, 100 tiny voices overlapping, forming a chorus of terror. She could feel them now touching her, brushing her arms, tugging at her jacket, circling her legs. She stumbled down the stairs, catching herself on a railing that pulsed like a vein, alive under her hands. The walls whispered louder, echoing her own thoughts. twisting them into fears she had never admitted even to herself. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cavernous room. The mist had seeped in entirely, swirling around her feet like water. Shadows coalesced into figures tall, thin, impossibly fast, their faces a shifting mosaic of fear and malice. Emma stumbled backward, her recorder rolling to the ground, playing back her own panicked breaths in high-pitched repetition. The figures reached for her, hands stretching impossibly long, fingertips brushing against her skin. Each touch sent ice through her veins, and each step she tried to take forward seemed to lead her deeper into the maze of shadows. Emma screamed, and the house screamed with her. The walls pulsed, bending inward, the floor trembling beneath her. The children surrounded her now, pale faces pressed close, their mouths moving in silent chanting. One of them, a small figure with hollow eyes and lips that barely moved, whispered directly into her mind, "Stay forever." Her sanity wavered. The fear clawed at the edges of her consciousness. In a desperate bid, she ran, trying to navigate the twisting hallways, but the house resisted. Doors led to walls, staircases folded back onto themselves, windows reflected nothing but darkness. The shadows lunged, disappearing before her eyes, only to appear somewhere else, closer. The whispers layered on top of each other, voices of the lost, the trapped, screaming and laughing, forming an unbearable symphony of horror. Then she saw it at the center of the room, a mirror-like black surface, smooth and reflective, but not quite glass. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Emma approached, drawn against her will, and saw herself for what she thought was herself trapped inside, eyes wide in terror, mouth moving but no sound emerging. And then the realization struck. This was her fate if she failed to escape. The hollow did not simply trap people. It absorbed them, turning them into shadows, into whispers, feeding the cycle. She tried to tear herself away, but the mist wrapped around her arms, pulling her closer. Hands pale, cold, inhuman grasped her, tugging at her body. The whispers became deafening, repeating one phrase over and over. "Join us. Belong, never leave." Emma's vision blurred, the world folding in on itself. She felt herself slipping, consciousness fraying as the children's presence overwhelmed her senses. And then, in a final instant of awareness,
Please like and subscribe channel Fear Frequency for more horror stories. Thank you.